It gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Shuruq Naguib. Now, we got to know Shuruq as part of a research project that I'm involved with, which is looking at the way that Christian and Muslim scientists explore their scriptures and understand their scriptures. And together with my postdoc researcher, Caroline T, we've been working on that for the last 18 months or so, or nearly 2 years now. And part of the project is that we have speakers coming to explore some of the themes of the project, and today's seminar is very much that. So Dr. Naguib is a lecturer in the University of Lancaster in the Politics, Philosophy and Religion department. She has a PhD in Islamic Studies from the University of Manchester, and her two main research foci have been Quranic hermeneutics and law and Muslim responses to modernity, and particularly contemporary women Muslim scholars and how they read the tradition. But she's also quite involved in projects to do with the way that Islam is perceived in Britain, and she has a research project on how Muslim women in Britain and Egypt have read their religious texts. So she's very involved both in the academic frame and in contemporary Islamic hermeneutics. And we're very glad that you've come, and we look forward to your seminar.
Thank you so much for this invitation. It's an honor to be back in Cambridge after our meeting last year on your project, and from the introduction. You can't hear. Can you hear me now? Is that better? Okay. Just thanking the organizers for the absolute pleasure of returning me to Cambridge after a year after the seminar that I participated in. From the introduction, I heard the word text so many times, and as you'll gather, I really find text quite fun to work with, and a lot of these slides actually are just text for you to reflect upon and me to comment upon. But before I start, let me introduce these names. I've changed the title slightly. So I'm still talking about scientific approaches to the Quran, scientific exegesis in technical terms, which is commentary on the Quran. But I'm looking at a particular woman exegete of the 20th century called Aisha Abdul Rahman Bint, or the pseudonym is Bint al-Shati. Let's see if this works. Yeah. Her image from her later years is quite well known in the Muslim world, but I particularly chose an image from her youth because her struggle as a woman, as an Egyptian woman coming from a rural background, learning, having a unique religious learning at home, but learning the religious sciences with her father without being allowed to go to school. And then because of certain tragic circumstances and her own struggle, she finally reached university, where she encountered a religious scholar with reformist ideas, her husband afterwards, and the person whose approach to Quran exegesis and reform she follows. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. But she eventually became the chair of Arabic studies in one of the prestigious universities in Egypt, and later the chair of Quranic studies, which is something very rare for women in the Muslim world, at least in her time, and still up to this day, in Morocco. She was a prolific writer. For anyone who's read the work of Schussler, Fiorenza, rewriting the history of women in Christianity, Bint al-Shati, which actually, the pseudonym actually means the daughter of the beach, and she chose that pseudonym because she was afraid of writing with her own name lest her father will find out and think of this behavior as scandalous. So Bint al-Shati, to achieve this renown as an Islamic scholar and acceptance as a woman scholar of Islam was actually quite unique in her own time, but even up to this moment. So this is how Bint al-Shati is spelled, at least. Some of her work especially around the 1960s, which brought her worldwide fame, not just in the Muslim world, but in all of the Islamic studies, at least communities, whether Muslim or non-Muslim, is a commentary on the Quran called the literary interpretation of the Quran in Arabic, for those who know Arabic here, al-Tafsir al-Bayani lil-Qur'an. Her approach was interesting because despite her religious training, she actually moves away from the usual techniques of the medieval exegetes to apply a rigorous and systematic linguistic approach. This was something that her husband, Amin al-Khuli, developed, but she also moved beyond her husband's approach, although as many women scholars and women philosophers who marry philosophers or people working in their field, they continue to credit their husbands or the male figure in their life with the key ideas, and this is what she continued to do throughout her works. However, she has moved beyond his approach. The literary approach she developed with her husband was particularly interesting because the attempt was not to revitalize religious thought by introducing new concepts surrounding faith or surrounding ethics or surrounding law, but by subjecting the Quran to a literary analysis or a linguistic analysis whereby the Quran will tell us what its key concepts are, what its key ideas are. So instead of starting from the idea, starting from the text to discover or uncover its goals. The Arabic word is maqasid, and from then on, from that time on, it became quite an important word for trying to distill Islamic ethics and Islamic theology to some key and principal ideas and values. The linguistic approach of Bint al-Shati and al-Khuli focused on the text, as I said, but not just the text in terms of its linguistic meaning, what it contains, but also what surrounds it in terms of, in Arabic, ma hawla al-nas, the world in which the Quran was revealed. So how do we understand late antiquity? So the Arabs and their neighbors before the coming of the Quran, how did they receive the Quran? What sort of languages they spoke? What sort of cultural practices they had? And trying to understand the Quran in that context, but also to understand the original meanings or the early meanings of the Arabic language, which may have informed the Quranic language. So really historicizing the Quran. These ideas might not sound so innovative today, but talking about the 1930s to the 1960s, they were quite interesting and new, and certainly there was quite a bit of resistance to the work. I want to give you a taste of how she applies her method. For example, her method can be described as cross-referential. So when she finds an interesting word in the Quran that nobody really can pin down to a meaning, and some of you may have worked with literary philology or philological analysis, so looking at the original meanings of the word, the different contexts in which it appears, and so on. So she does that kind of work. But she also applies a concept of intertextuality. So if there's an interesting word in the Quran, as in this verse, which doesn't appear in this particular structure elsewhere, I have written it in Arabic. It's from chapter 102 of the Quran. Then on that day, you will be asked concerning Na'im. Na'im occurs in the Quran, but in different types of phrases, not in this form. So in order to understand what this word actually means, she goes through all the derivatives of that word in the Quran and in the Arabic sources surrounding the time of the Quran. She also looks at the exegetical material, so what the medieval scholar says. And she gives us an example of what the medieval scholars say. Someone from the 13th century of the Common Era, 7th century of the Muslim calendar, says, for example, Na'im here means many things. It has several aspects. One aspect is that the least kind of pleasure is the pleasure of wearing a sandal and not having to go barefoot. The highest is encountering the Prophet. So that's wearing the sandals and encountering the Prophet are two types of pleasure, or two poles of a continuum of different types of pleasure, which will be asked about at some moment in time. It also includes giving of the Qur'an, sustenance, drink, dwelling, a nice lunch. I could add a warm coat for today. So all sorts of pleasures are included or could be included in that interpretation. All of which actually depend, they are not haphazard, but depend on possible meanings in the Arabic language attested by poetic citations or ancient Arabic poetry or other idiomatic usages in the Arabic language. But Bint al-Shati is very concerned. How come a divine text, which is intended to give guidance, to actually lead to confusion surrounding meaning? How can we pin down the meaning? So Bint al-Shati accepts polysemy, multiple meanings are possible, but when it comes to the specific context of the Quran, in each context the word will probably or potentially have an intended meaning which is preferred over the others. Here she goes to the Quran itself and she says, we're going to seek the Quran's judgment rather than apply our own reasoning. And I'll talk about her feminine hermeneutic language if we have time. So the primary way of doing it is cross-referencing across the Quran, and she finds that on the 15 occasions where this word occurs in this format in the Quran, it actually occurs in relation to paradise. Naim of paradise, or the pleasure of paradise. There are other derivatives like ni'ma, ni'ma, etc. Sorry, I hope the Arabic doesn't sound too foreign. Maybe, hopefully it sounds a bit musical. So all of these derivatives occur in the Quran with different connotations, but na'im always, except on this occasion, occurs in relation or in conjunction with paradise. And in this particular context, she says, the primary theme of this surah is all about the hereafter. So the first verse actually talks about the transient worldly pleasures, about which will be asked in the hereafter. What did you do with your life? How did you enjoy these pleasures? How did you use the bounties that were given to you? So the running theme of the text itself, of the context of this word, is actually about the hereafter. In that sense, or in this case, Bint al-Shati sees no other possible meaning but that this word pleasure here refers to experiences that will come in the afterlife. This is just a crude example, and her method is far more richer, and her approach to each chapter of the Quran is actually multi-layered. But she goes back to comment upon medieval interpretations, and she says the same about contemporary and scientific interpretations, as we'll see later. That variations in tastes, mentalities, milieus, personalities, different cultural contexts, stretching from China, India to Marrakesh and Spain, all of which led to different doctrinal, political, and sectarian approaches to the Quran. But no one has consulted the Quran on its own terms, and she has this confidence in the linguistic approach whereby you can read the text on its own terms. So her approach is really linguistic. And how does this compare to the popular approach that emerges in the late 1960s in the Arab world particularly? It has roots in the 19th century attempt to reconcile Islam to reason and Islam to science, where the reformist thinkers actually tried to find Quranic verses which prove that the Quran calls upon people to think rationally, but also sometimes found actual scientific facts and truth in the Quran. This became really popular in the 1960s, and in the Arab world, it was popularized through a series of articles written by a man called Mustafa Mahmud, who was a medical doctor, but also a journalist, and he was writing in a magazine called Good Morning. It was a liberal kind of magazine that was very popular in the 70s, 60s to 80s in Egypt. And he wrote a series of articles and later presented a program called Faith and Science. And the series of articles was called the contemporary or a contemporary approach to the Quran, whereby he prioritizes, he sees that the only way we can understand the Quran today is to measure it against our scientific knowledge, our contemporary understanding, which comes from the different sciences of genetics, biology, geology, etc. That's the only way we can actually appreciate the miracle of the Quran and not the linguistic approach. So he's really on the other end of what Bint al-Shati is doing, where she's saying that the eloquence, the language, this is where the secrets and the miracle actually lies, because the meanings we can delve deeper into these meanings. So Mustafa Mahmud was a contemporary writer like Bint al-Shati, as I said, and his famous TV series had actually this very well-known theme. If it doesn't load, it's all right. You actually heard it at the beginning when we were trying out. It's very eerie. It's more like hearing a program or watching a program on the paranormal than on sciences. So he wrote this series of articles in which he tried to find, to talk about the Quranic references to the atom. And I'll give you a lot of examples now. Quranic references to creation, comparing Darwin to the Quran and so on. This became extremely popular because people found a sense of relief in it. But Bint al-Shati was one of the early critics. She was a staunch critic and someone with her authority and renown and prestige in the Arab world. It came as a surprise that she would, and given that she's actually considered a modern interpreter of the Quran in the sense that she moves beyond the medieval approaches and emphasizes a new linguistic approach. It was strange that she would resist the coming of a scientific interpretation of the Quran. I want to perhaps contextualize her objections to Mahmud. Mahmud was a case study, but she was actually critiquing the whole venture of scientific interpretation and considering it a kind of popular or a kind of anti-intellectual, actually would be the right word, anti-intellectual approach to the Quran. And I'll explain now how she comes to that conclusion. A very famous TV episode, and this also comes in the articles, was called The House of the Spider. So there is this verse in the Quran which says the likeness, it's actually a chapter called The House of the Spider. The likeness of those who have taken to them protectors apart from God is as the likeness of the spider that takes to itself a house. And surely the frailest or the weakest of houses is the house of the spider, that they but know. I can even remember my father's voice calling me to come very quickly to hear this important scientific interpretation. So Mustafa Mahmud actually interprets this as a miracle, a scientific miracle, which is a genre or a running theme in scientific interpretations of the Quran, finding facts that no one could have understood or known about in the Quran 1400 years ago, but only now with the scientific research that we can find out about the greatness and hence the veracity and the true origin of the Quran being divine is further proven. So Mustafa Mahmud comments on this verse saying, the fact that strikes you immediately is the reference to the house of the spider and not the cobweb. Science tells us that actually doesn't make a lot of sense in the Arabic language. Science tells us today that a single web is 3 times stronger than a comparable thread of steel. So there's a kind of contradiction between science and the Quran. The cobweb, the threads are very strong, but the Quran refers to the house of the spider as frail and weak. That's a contradiction between science and the Quran. It might come across as convoluted, but he was making this argument. Even more interesting is that, this house would serve the needs of the spider, So why is it frail? Why is the likeness with the spider here relevant? Now, another biological secret in the verse, recently revealed, and he uses the word revelation similar to the word revelation of scriptures. The truth of the matter is that the female spider weaves the cobweb. So the female spider, not the male spider, are responsible for the house or the cobweb. And is the ruler therein. She kills the male immediately after mating and devours him. The litter eat one another after hatching. Hardly a house. He probably means a home. This is an official translation by someone called Mahmud. More perhaps like a slaughterhouse where fear and anguish reign. So it's described as the frailest of the houses, not because it's a weak home or a weak structure, but because as a home, you cannot seek refuge in it. So when you seek protectors other than God, with them, there's no home, there's no refuge. Makes sense? Yeah? Okay. But the real secret, the real miracle, is that the Quran is referring to the she spider rather than to the he spider. Interesting scientific fact, which matches the Quran now. This is what he says. It is perfection itself, precise expression, hidden meaning, hidden scientific meaning, that is, rightly placed words and secrets revealed by science 1,000 years after the Prophet's death. This is no doubt a miracle which the mind can explain in no other way than by attributing it to a divine source. Okay, this is very popular. This became extremely popular, especially amongst young people who were finding medieval type of exegesis, which was propagated by preachers on television, quite problematic, inaccessible. Especially the usage of Arabic rhetoric, which could be really complex and difficult to understand. Compared to this is wonderful. I loved it. I never forgot the actual way he said it. But that was 25 years ago or more. So what does Bint al-Shati say about this? She actually finds this very problematic and absurd. One of the reasons she finds this absurd is that for any student of Arabic, anyone here knows Arabic? Not even a little bit? Just a little bit? Okay. So when we say ant, what do you say in Arabic? Sorry? Ant or bee? One. Namla, in the feminine. You got it now? So all insects, all animals, whether in the singular or the plural, are referred to in the Arabic language in the feminine pronoun. So the feminine agreement goes with animals and non-living things. So Bint al-Shati is saying there's no secret here, because if you had asked, hypothetically, if you had asked a pagan Arab long time before Islam to talk about the spider building a house or taking a house, he would have said the she spider built the house using feminine agreement, because these are the rules of the Arabic language. And she feels very concerned about trying to hinge scientific truth on linguistic structure where the evidence is very weak. And also the image, the poetic image within the Quran, you have to go the long way around to understand the image, whereas we all understand that the cobweb is weak and we can see it fall apart. There's no need to talk about home as different from cobweb. And she talks about the apparent linguistic meaning. There's this tradition in the Arabic language, which builds on the Aristotelian tradition in rhetoric, which is based on logical or logic, whereby any text cannot be understood except through a linguistic analysis which finds logical proofs and logical evidence for moving from a literal meaning toward a metaphor. Even modern rhetoricians will make the same argument. In order to provide a metaphorical interpretation of a text, there has to be some kind of root or indicator or dalil in Arabic in the text itself to move from the apparent to the less apparent, or from the literal to the metaphorical. So she feels that here the poetic image is clear and apparent. There is no need to, to find a contradiction with science in order to resolve it. And time flies. To sum up her objections after giving you that example of the house of the spider, interestingly, she actually calls, she has written a series of articles where she titled them Al-Qur'an and Contemporary Interpretation, and they appeared in a book, and likewise his articles appeared in the book, and the two books speak to each other. So in her book, she has a special chapter called The House of the Spider, whereby she talks about the hermeneutic weakness. So his hermeneutics is like the house of the spider. So she uses this as a pun. She's very clever and sarcastic, actually. And I felt, the first time I read the book, I felt really embarrassed after all the hype surrounding those scientific discoveries. So her objections to scientific interpretation is not an objection to science, but an objection to transposing scientific facts onto the Qur'an. The approach of Mustafa Mahmud serves as an example, whereby she identifies certain problems. I've tried to summarize them here, and I'll explain them a bit more. So scientific interpretation is conjunctural. You have to find the word which you think links to a scientific fact and then do the interpretation. There is a kind of tyranny whereby you impose a certain epistemic paradigm, a certain system of knowledge on the scriptures, and you have to, the scriptures have to fit in with that, have to, be in harmony with that. It's transient because some of this knowledge becomes obsolete. We all know that, especially in the last few decades, that things change so much, and our theories, even within science, of understanding the world also change, and that the idea that there's no scientific theory that is neutral or presuppositionalist is something that is common knowledge now. It's arbitrary. The method is arbitrary. It's verse-based. It's phrase-based. You can't, there is no rigorous or systematic way of deducing meaning or relation to science or to some of these things. It's also arbitrary in terms of authority. So who actually applies, that's a big question in Bint al-Shati, who actually is qualified to apply this scientific interpretation? She does concede that, if you're a physicist or a chemist or a zoologist and you find something interesting in the Quran that speaks to your discipline, you could reflect upon it. But she uses so many words like you could reflect upon it, you could see where it engages with your discipline, but she never says interprets. She says that interpret is different to understanding, engaging, reflecting upon. Interpret is a formal activity that requires a methodical approach. It's decontextualized. So again, you take bits of text out of their context. Now the linguist here is really annoyed. The linguist in Bint al-Shati is very annoyed because the whole example of the house of the spider has a context, but there are other parts or other examples from Mahmud. I was going to mention another supporter of scientific exegesis, Mahmud Muhammad Taha. This one is called Mustafa Mahmud. Thank you. So she actually looks at the decontextualization that leaves the Quran, like the medieval exegetes, in her opinion, quite fragmented. She's looking for a method, a system whereby you can look at the Quran as a structure, as a text, as a literary text, that even though it might not appear as unified, but it has its own conventions that through applying a linguistic approach you can find out about. It's escapist. It's an easy way out. We knew about this 1400 years ago. They haven't gone far. We've had this knowledge, scientific knowledge, in our book, and we have even more. So it's kind of escapist sense of superiority that, rather than encouraging science, it actually undermines the the need to or the desire and motive to try to catch up. This is quite an interesting motif that appears in 20th century writers. Catch up with Western scientific advances and progress, etc. Do we have 5 minutes for more? I mean, I could stop here or give you more examples of Mahmud's. 5 minutes, okay. So, in terms of conjecture, for example, let me move to some of the verses that I want to use, and I can lay this to rest. So one of the verses, and they have thereof no knowledge they follow, but their conjecture, and indeed conjecture avails not against the truth. So this is a hermeneutic principle in the Quran. So she actually says there are hermeneutic principles in the Quran, and we have to take them into consideration. Otherwise, we're actually, if we're saying this is a divine text and has scientific truth or has truth in them, how can we not take into consideration its own hermeneutic approaches, which it suggests to us or guides us to use? So, and she gives the example that the Quran actually dissuaded people from speculating on things that they don't know about. She mentions the example of people who might have asked the Prophet about the moons. The moons are very mystical. We used to worship them. What about the moons? Why do we have a lunar calendar? They ask you concerning the new moons, and God actually tells them, just follow them for time management, time measurement. Don't speculate on their nature, on their mystical meaning, etc. So she reads the Quran here. She reads the principle, the hermeneutic principle of avoiding or not following conjecture as actually more scientific than attempting to speculate a scientific meaning. The example, she actually describes the example of the house of spider as hermeneutic tyranny. It's trying to enclose the text within a certain system. But, for example, transience of scientific interpretations. I don't think I've put the verse here, but there is a verse in the Quran which says, and the moon we have preordained its stations, till it came to be like an aged palm bough. So this is something from the desert environment, where a palm bough comes or falls off a palm tree and becomes rounded, but it's also very dry. So according to Mustafa Mahmud, he says, okay, this is again not almost actually, he says this is a literal likeness to what science has discovered about the moon. It's dry, it's lifeless, there's no sign of anything living, and it lacks water. This is the literal likeness with the dry bough or branch of a palm tree. But Bint al-Shati is thinking, what if we discover life on the moon? What if we discover water on the moon? What do you do with this? You've pinned down the meaning of the Quran on something changeable, transient, that even within months, I think, of that interpretation, she mentioned that she read an article about possibility of water in the solar system, including the moon. What more examples do we have? One issue, of course, is interpretive authority. where she considers arbitrary approaches to the Quran by interested and amateur exegetes to be problematic because it popularizes certain views and it makes them familiar to people, and familiarity does not breed contempt, according to Bint al-Shati, but breeds a false type of authority. So these interpretations become authoritative. There's a kind of closure toward further or potential interpretations that could be more current amongst the people. But perhaps the crux of the debate is this relegation or even discrimination against the Prophet himself. I don't know if any of you have picked that up, but Prophet Muhammad in Islam is not just a messenger who relayed a message. He also explained it, he also imbibed it in his behavior. So his life was exegetical. Now, Mustafa Mahmud often refers to the Prophet and his milieu as the vulgar Bedouins. He doesn't say this about the Prophet, but he refers to his milieu as the vulgar Bedouins, and hence undermining the possibility of early understanding. There's a kind of historical elitism whereby the later you move on, the better you understand, the more superior you are. A kind of social evolutionism which Bint al-Shati has a problem with. Now, to sum up, I skipped several examples. In terms of conclusion, what can we say about Bint al-Shati and her approach to scientific exegesis? She definitely rejects this type of transposition of scientific facts onto the Quran. She talks about truth as not about facts or phenomena or physical phenomenon, but truth in terms of meaning about our existence. The Quran needs to be interrogated because we have serious existential questions. Science can tell us about technology, about facts, but it can't answer our bigger existential issues. But the Quran says it's guidance for us in terms of values, in terms of how to live our lives. And in that sense, she reads the truth as ethical truth. She reads truth in terms of meaning rather than fact. And perhaps, in a way, refusing to set up an arbitrary relationship between the Quran and science. She's following she's more of a follower of the rationalist approach within the history of Islam, which is attributed to Averroes or Ibn Rushd, whereby he talked about science and faith and science and scriptures as two expressions of truth, but two different systems, two different languages that speak to different people in different ways. On the other side, in terms of Islamic history of thought, we have the figure of al-Ghazali, who's a little bit like Augustine for Christianity, and al-Ghazali believed that all knowledge resides in the Quran, and his understanding of the Quran, or his magnum opus revivification of the religious sciences, included mysticism, included logic, or some aspects of Greek philosophy, included language, included a lot of things in trying to understand the Quran. That kind of eclecticism is what led to, according to Bint al-Shati, is what led to a confusion about the meaning of the Quran. A rationalist approach requires us to separate the two realms without actually, and that's the way you create or develop a harmony between the two, rather than create contradictions by trying to put them or read one into the other. I think I'll stop here and give some time to questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and absolutely fascinating, and I'm sure there'll be lots of questions, but can I just ask one thing that I was dying to ask? Okay. Is kind of what happened? Has there been a lot of controversy between these two about, did she get a lot of antagonism from Mahmud?
She definitely got antagonism from the liberal milieu, especially within within the journalists milieu of Cairo in the 1960s. Some people described her as donning on a turban, defending defending traditionalism, defending the traditional image of the sheikh or the religious scholar. She stopped talking about scientific interpretation because she had other projects that she wanted to talk about. He moved into television, and this became a much more popular kind of genre of interpretation, and it still continues. Her objections are there, and with the digitization of a lot of our textual sources in the world, but particularly in the world of Islam, you can download so much stuff. And I've managed to find all of her works except that work. So interestingly, it didn't become popular, and people don't think it's important, don't buy her argument. And I think in terms of popular discourse, yeah, scientific interpretation still has currency.
Okay, I'm sure there are other questions, and Rachel's going to come around with a microphone, the middle of this section here. Yes.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for your talk. I had one question about, you mentioned scientific interpretive tyranny. So that phenomena is maybe not just restricted to sort of the scientific realm, but for example, people, when they have a certain message, the Qur'an is a great source to draw upon and to inspire people. And you hear it in terms of social justice as well, people talking about the Qur'an in those terms. So the question I wanted to ask was, how do you see these kind of movements, or these which may be fighting or standing for very good things, but then use the Qur'an in such a way that they're imposing this kind of tyranny over it? How do you view that phenomena, and is that something problematic if it's being used for a good end, or should we be challenging this to maintain the integrity of the text?
Okay, I'm a sympathetic reader of Bint al-Shati, which you might have guessed. Sorry, was there a question or? Yeah, I think you're right. This is something that she points out, that the problem is not between science and Quran or science and religion. It's the problem between, or what we need to reconcile is between two systems of authority. It's the men of religion and the men of science who are having the fight, and she uses the word men. She doesn't use the word men and women, or she's very careful about her gendered language. So men of science and men of religion are fighting or contesting each other's realms or spheres of authority and control over meaning, especially in the Muslim world. She has felt this kind of tyranny herself because of her new approach. Her husband was suspended from the university. She eventually had to leave Egypt. She was never appointed as an Islamic studies scholar in Egypt, and so on. So yes, definitely. But she compares the medievalists with the modernists, or those who can describe themselves as being contemporary or being modern. But the argument you're making has been recently made in a very different context by a reader of feminist hermeneutics of the Quran, a feminist herself called Aisha Hidayatullah, where she talks about liberal, progressive interpretations of the Quran as being dogmatic, and not realizing that they are being dogmatic, because they are using their approach as universal, as the end of history kind of approach to the Quran, but it's tyrannical. Why not entertain the possibility of other ways of reading the Quran, which could be legitimate, or etc. So, but her argument is also different, because she would say that taking the Quran as a divine text without challenging that or accepting challenge is also a kind of tyranny. So anyway, yes, you're absolutely right. There are many interpretive tyrannies, and it's not just the medieval or traditional form of tyranny. There are, modernist, liberalist, progressive, etc. And that's why she, in her hermeneutics, sorry for the long-winded answer, in her hermeneutics, she doesn't say that we're reading or interpreting the Quran. She uses many words, and I've looked across her interpretation of the Quran where she says, listen to. نستقرئ. It's a difficult word to translate. It's like seek the Quran to read itself for us. By putting all the texts next to each other and seeing them speak in conversation to one another, listening to the intimations or turning our attention to the intimations. So it's as if the Quran is trying to speak and has been trying to speak all over the world and in different times, but we're not listening because we're imposing. Yeah, this is problematic in itself, but this is her view anyway.
There's a question right over at the back there, and then we'll come a bit further forward.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you
Walaikum
for the lovely talk. I know there's also a scholar, Hamza Tsotsas, and he talks about like in the 1990s when Islamic propagation centers would always use these miracles of the Quran arguments and use this, in the propagation of Islam. But I think that is slow, like things are slowly moving on, and that is changing with the similar arguments. The question I had is, you said, we should move away from looking at the scientific revelations and rather focus on ethical issues. My question is, do these hermeneutical problems still come up even with trying to get ethical understandings from the Quran? I mean, the argument doesn't extend to ethical issues as well as scientific issues.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. She prioritizes the moral, the ethical, the philosophical, the hermeneutic, how do we understand, She has a whole treatise on how does the Quran help us understand understanding, so understand hermeneutics in that sense. In a way, she's in between being a modernist and a postmodernist. I don't want to use too many technical terms, but in a sense, she believes in the potential of a systematic method. So by being methodical, we can still reach a potentially true meaning for us. A meaning that answers our questions today, which has groundedness and rootedness in historical context, historical texts, etc. So it's not just about us reading the text today. It's about interrogating the text for ourselves, for our questions, big ethical, philosophical questions, but in a way that is grounded in the past, but not restricted by it. But she doesn't say that all understanding is completely situated and historically and culturally specific, and there is no true meaning to the Quran. It's only the way we read it. She sits somewhere in between where she believes in a true reading, but she believes in it as being accumulative, as being open, never completely closed. But we can't say that what we've reached today is just a relative understanding of the Quran. It is a more correct understanding, especially if we follow the systematic and methodical. She's very interesting. So she's neither a modernist completely nor a postmodernist.
There's a question here.
Hello, thank you very much. It was a very interesting lecture. So you showed the pictures of Bint al-Shati, is that? And I was wondering, she's not wearing a hijab. And as a Muslim woman, especially in that time, I mean, I'm a Muslim woman and I'm asked this question very often. So I'm wondering if this was her, you would know about her life story. Was she able to reach this conclusion through Quran, or was she ever questioned about it? How was she perceived as a religious scholar who's not wearing a hijab?
Okay, thank you for that question. It's a very interesting question, and it's for that reason that I've shown her picture when she was young, as opposed to her later picture when she was just wearing a small scarf around her head, which is associated more with middle age in Egyptian society than with hijab as such. Yes, hijab was understood more as not going out in public. So by the 1920s, the 1930s, most young women and middle-class women in Egypt did not wear a headscarf. They still dressed modestly. There wasn't a sense in which covering the head was seen as necessarily an Islamic obligation. I don't know, she never talked about the hijab. She never discussed this. She never thought of it as, an important topic. She has written on the theology of the human being or theology of humanity. She has written about the Islamic liberation of women, concepts that we can use in Islam to liberate women, rhetorics, history, literary analysis. She never talked about the hijab, but she did don a small scarf in her later years when she, maybe in her 60s or 70s. And she considered, and she talked, when she talked about her early experiences, she talked about them in terms of escaping from the harem, escaping from the world of segregation, in very modernist terms, which of course perhaps do not reflect all historical realities and could be problematized, but these were her terms. So the hijab was understood, or the separation was understood more as a separation between public and private spheres. The code of dress that we wear today, or the importance of the hijab, was not perceived in the same way. My grandmother's generation, my mother's generation did not wear the hijab in Egypt. It's only my generation that started to wear the hijab. The younger generation is starting to take off the hijab. So, it's an interesting development, but it wasn't always the most important topic in Islamic life.
Thank you. There's a question here, and then we'll go to you.
Thank you. My question is coming from Pakistan, where I've been working, and where in about the period you've been talking about, 1910, the great Muslim leader Muhammad Iqbal once admired Einstein's great new vision of the universe. Now, in Pakistan itself, I find that rather than contrary to this kind of enlightened view of the world from a leading Muslim familiar with the Qur'an, and also a very fine poet, every year we had a certain kind of problem where the mullahs, imams and muftis sitting in Islamabad at the end of Ramzan saw the moon appear, the beginning of Eid, at a different time, possibly after midnight, than the mullahs where I was in Peshawar, who thought they saw the moon. Now, if those mullahs, muftis and imams had perhaps all been given a better basic understanding of science, and if all the madrasas taught physics, wouldn't this help the some of the hermeneutical problems of scripture?
Yes. Yes, thank you very much. I mean, the moon sighting is a vexing question for all sorts of practical and theological reasons. But what you're talking about is jurisprudence. And jurisprudence within Islamic history has always incorporated non-scriptural sources because it's to do with people's everyday life. So yes, absolutely, Bint al-Shati and a lot of jurists, even with traditional background today, would argue that it is important to have scientific education, medical understanding as much as possible. And there are attempts to set up fatwa councils or councils for religious rulings, which incorporate specialized people in the different disciplines of science. So yes, I agree with that, but I wouldn't know what the actual dynamics of the Pakistani context are. But I know in other Muslim countries there's a move to more technological ways of sighting the moon. But it is a big topic, yeah. And the fact that we Muslims can't agree on how to do it today is not so much a problem of science as a problem of how religious authority is perceived and how Sharia is applied. And
there's a question here, gentleman in the waistcoat.
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum assalam.
I think we kind of agree that science can tell us about nature and the physical world, and religion is there to ask or address the more existential questions. But what do you think about the ideas of those people who believe, people like Sayyid Hussein Nasr or Osman Bakr, who believe that even doing scientific research should be embedded in the Islamic understanding of the nature of reality, of nature, and as a sympathetic reader of the exegete, what do you think she would have said about this kind of approach where even doing scientific research should be guided by the Islamic philosophy of science?
Okay, I think I will follow her advice and not to give you any, speculative answers or conjectural knowledge, because it would be difficult to, she died about 20 years ago, and in her last 20 years, she was probably not up to date with all the arguments. But they come more from, from a project whereby they were trying to Islamize knowledge. They were trying to construct. It's a different type of project. Her view was that we're actually at a very basic stage. Before we Islamize knowledge, before we construct an epistemic paradigm for understanding the world, including the sciences, we need to understand the basics of the message. So she was very humble in her ambitions. To understand the basics of the message, let's start with the first thing, which is language. So she was, in a way, closer to Heidegger than, to some of the medieval philosophers, whereby she was saying, okay, the only way we are going to understand the message of God or the world is through language, and let's do the linguistic analysis first, or start with it, doesn't stop, before we have any major project. So that's her position. So the reconstruction of, big epistemic, it's actually in a way also a more masculine thing to try to do, to try to explain the world, and she was more engaged with the text and the word, and she was working at a different level. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, well, sadly, we are out of time. We always finish promptly at 2 o'clock, as you know. So let's just thank Shuruq again for a very interesting seminar.